Hello, and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. Hi, Saul. I know we're here to talk about authoritarianism and its implications for the medical profession. How worried do you think we should be, and how is this relevant to On Becoming a Healer as a podcast?
Hi, Stefan. I think I'll reply to your question, not necessarily by giving my own opinion up front, but more by commenting on what I would consider to be eminent scholarship. If you look at statements and writings of people who have written extensively on the topic of fascism and totalitarianism, I'm thinking of Jason Stanley at Yale, Timothy Snyder. Dr. Stanley, by the way, has written How Fascism Works and Erasing History. Dr. Snyder has written a book called On Tyranny and the Road to Unfreedom. I'm thinking of Maria Ressa, the Nobel laureate who challenged Duterte. I'm thinking of Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum, the author of Autocracy Incorporated and Twilight of Democracy. All of them are essentially saying the same thing. They're saying that this is a fascist takeover. And if anything is surprising them, it's that it's moving faster than even they would have expected. They all describe the same stepwise process. And I think what's particularly chilling is they wrote this stuff before current events. They talk about how process of transition from democracy to fascism begins with attacking higher education, attacking the legal system, barring certain language and words, purging the government workforce, putting cronies in power, constant lying, banning press, attacking marginalized groups, alienating international partners and allies. And a commonality of all of this is weaponizing the power of the government to get its people, including the Justice Department, the IRS, the powers of the president, and eventually the military. And again, this is what they're describing. And what we're seeing is almost like somebody's following a cookbook. And so I leave it to our listeners to form their own opinions, because I know some people will think this is really extreme. I'm just going to start by saying that for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to take what they say very seriously. And I think that we should focus specifically on what this means for medical professionals and for our profession. And that's, I think, a great starting point for our episode today.
You've referred to both scholars of fascism, and you've referred to a lot of, a fair number of current events in the United States. Another scholar of fascism named Robert Paxton talks about that word itself as one that sometimes generates more heat than light, that saying something is fascist can be so provocative. He says it's almost like setting off a paint bomb. I imagine there are probably people who are going to take issue with that word in particular, and let's acknowledge that. But let's turn to, how does this speak to us in the moment of being in an institution called medicine? We are practitioners of medicine. How could any of the things going on that you've just said have anything to do with us?
Yeah, very, very important question, I think. It's very easy to think that, you're not part of the problem. Unfortunately, in the history of authoritarianism and fascism, and again, if you don't like fascism, you can use the word authoritarianism, whatever you choose, the medical profession has not looked good. It's often been very quick to jump on the bandwagon without any coercion, and we can talk a little bit about that. Obviously, what happened in Germany is a worst-case example of that, but by no means the only one. I think that what we're seeing today is a lot of institutions quickly giving up on their cherished values, whether it's big law, big academia, media, big business, whether it's their commitment to the rule of law, to academic freedom, to equity and inclusion. They're quickly capitulating and essentially making deals in the hope that this monster won't come and eat them up. And so I think that should be a warning to all of us as we watch this. And I think that what we should be talking about today is what's happening within the medical profession. Are we already capitulating? If so, what are we doing that's wrong? And I think there is quite a bit to talk about. One of the things that I think is really interesting is a comment made by Timothy Snyder, one of the four scholars of fascism. And he writes, when political leaders set a negative example, professional commitments to just practice become more important. Authoritarians need obedient servants. And he goes on to say, professions can create forms of ethical conversation that are impossible between a lonely individual and a distant government. If members of professions think of themselves as groups with common interests, with norms and rules that oblige them at all times, then they can gain confidence and a certain kind of power. Professional ethics must guide us precisely when we are told that the situation is exceptional. Then there is no such thing as just following orders. And I think that at a moment when we're being told not to use certain words in our grant proposals, not to care for certain kinds of patients, and we're being told that certain marginalized groups don't deserve to be recognized, I think that this is a time where we, as a profession, need to think really hard about what our anchor is and how we remain anchored at this time. I think that's what Professor Snyder is getting at. And I'm hoping we can have a bit of that conversation today.
Okay, so a lot's just happened in the last 3 minutes of this conversation. So the first part I hear is like lots of other institutions are bowing to pressure from the US federal government at this time. So maybe simple example, there is a series of orders were issued by our president concerning what law firms can do business inside federal buildings and whether they can retain their clients. And many, not all, but a good number of those law firms have made deals more or less saying, we agreed to abide by what you want us to do and to give you free services for purposes that you want us to pursue if you'll just lay off. So that's an example of a those are big law firms. So that's an example of an institution giving way. It could be that, is there an analogy in medicine? I mean, is there a moment where the AMA or the medical profession really has said, hey, we feel under the gun here. We're going to give way in terms of what we do in healthcare? Or are we imagining that into the future in a reasonable way?
I think that if you look at these long lists of forbidden words, and by the way, they include Black, climate crisis, disability, discrimination, disparity, equality, female, health equity, inclusive, inequality, injustice, marginalized, men who have sex with men, non binary, prejudice, racism, segregation, trauma, unconscious bias, victims, and women. Now, they're not totally banned words. They're words that have been stripped in a big way from a lot of federal websites, and grantees are advised to be very cautious about using these words. And they've certainly been used to kill many, many grant proposals. And then the question, of course, is what are we going to do about that? Are we just going to say, okay, well, we'll be sure to write grant proposals that don't use those words? But of course, how does that affect what we study and what we do research on? I'm seeing on my end a tendency for people to just sort of say, okay, I got to work around this. Maybe I should study something different. Similarly, we have hospitals and medical centers that are saying, okay, well, we'll just stop this caring for people who are transgender or who are having gender dysphoria. We'll just stop. And so if I look at major organizations like the American Medical Association, I see them with their usual plug for things that are of benefit to the profession. Like, they're very unhappy about a 2.8% Medicare cut that
Yeah,
could be retained.
we want
But
our
there's nothing
money.
on their website. There's nothing on the website about an $800 billion cut to Medicaid that the Republican caucus is pushing for. And so I think that there's a lot going on here that is of great concern. I think it should be a great concern to physicians. It's easy to think of these words as being not a big deal, right?
Hmm.
But these words are erasing people, and they're erasing values that we have held dear. When you say that you can't use the word non-binary anymore, it's like, okay, it's a word. What can I do? But you have done something deeply harmful and hurtful by erasing a group of people. When you say that you can't use a word like health equity, for instance, well, gosh, that's been at the center of our profession's mission over the last however many years to focus on that, to address that challenge. So I think that these words have a lot behind them. And so I'm troubled by our readiness to just sort of let bygones be bygones. I also think there's a lot of what people call
Obedience?
anticipatory obedience.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, for instance, early on, gosh, we've only been in this for a couple of months, but early on, one of my colleagues sent out an email telling us we probably should remove that little statement about pronouns from our emails before it was even mentioned. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, how do I do that? Because it was within a system where you had to kind of log in and
How do I
figure out
get
how to
that out?
remove it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's this. What I'm not seeing is a lot of pushback. I'm seeing a lot of like, okay, what do we do now? Just help me out. Tell me how I fix this so we can move on. And that's very concerning because how far will this go? Well, if this is fascism, this is not the end. This is the very, very beginning.
Mm.
And I think it's worth talking about that because it's always early on that you want to start to establish your ethical beliefs and principles and what's going to guide you forward.
I want to give credit to a point you made, and then I want to challenge you in two different ways because I think they're challenges that are just an ordinary part of the back and forth of political discourse that I think have to come up in this. So, first of all, I'm going to accept or underscore a point you made. Just speaking for myself, and not in terms of my care of my patient, but in terms of my scholarship, I read about these various words that were going to draw adverse attention And I found myself writing a manuscript in which we used the word inclusion in the statistics section. The language was the inclusion criteria for incorporation in this analysis was based on the following characteristics. And I sat there and I literally tried to come up with ways to change the word inclusion in the statistical sense of that word to something else just because I was, I guess, engaged in anticipatory obedience. So I want to grant you credence that that's working in my head. And I don't think it's a good thing. But there is some pushback, Saul. The first thing I want to highlight is that a lot of what you're seeing now would be understood by others who have brains and thoughts and minds of their own, as pushback against a kind of illiberalism that was present in academic and in health academic environments over the last 5 to 10 years. For example, one that I resonated with is that in many academic medical institutions, people seeking positions were evaluated on the basis of a mandatory diversity and equity statement that they had to write as a kind of essay, many of which were graded according to a rubric. That could be seen as a kind of illiberalism because the diversity of thought is not encouraged in that situation. I think we could come up with other examples of situations where, in the effort to address health disparities or to promote equity, sometimes there are ways in which various words, ideas, and concepts became forbidden in academic environments. And the average, potentially conservative person would feel pretty unwelcome. And those people might say, hey, don't worry, I understand that there might be an overreaction going on. Many people I speak with are pretty smart about this, but at the same time, there's a response to something that seemed illiberal before coming from the left. And maybe that's just kind of how the cookie crumbles.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up because it is an important issue or perspective to address. And here's how I think about it. A lot of the concerns that you're raising are legitimate, but I think it's a big mistake to think that those concerns justify what's happening now. And I think
Hmm.
one of the things I found so helpful about reading the work of these scholars of fascism is that they're describing a pattern at the level of an authoritarian government that gives you a kind of big picture of what's going on. And I kind of laid it out. As I said, it's almost a cookbook. So let's take, for example, Columbia, Columbia University, because that's been in the news lately. So, there are people who would say, well, there's been some anti Semitism on Columbia University's campus, and so they are getting what they deserve. Now, the fact that there may be anti Semitism on Columbia's campus is probably true, but there are standard ways of dealing with racism, prejudice, bias on campuses. And it doesn't involve an all out assault where you cut off $400 million of grants that have nothing to do with it, that you start demanding that the campus adopt authoritarian practices, violate. Of course, you see what I'm saying? These two,
Hmm.
A does not require B. And I think B is a well understood approach to destroying democracy. And so I think it's really important to keep these two conversations separate. I am a huge advocate for conversations about how we address all sorts of concerns related to the issues you raised. But I think it's critical not to be duped into thinking that what's happening now is the solution to that problem. And I think it's so important to conceptualize it in a way that has a historical basis. Because if you don't do that, you basically are seeing the trees, but not the forest. And I think the issue is, what are the implications for those of us who are in the medical profession or in the health professions generally, given historical precedent for what sometimes happens that is unethical and wrong in the world of medicine.
I hear that, and I think that it's just a reasonable defense to let stand for now. Like, I don't think we should deliberate over that more. Some people are going to say, "Hey, I know that," but there is the second point I was going to bring up, and this is going to bring it a little bit closer to medicine. We won't get all the way into medical profession yet, but we're going to get a little closer. The situations where the federal government exercises the most leverage often involve federal money. And there's situations where, like universities, and I wonder, healthcare institutions receive money from the taxpayer, and you're in a bargain. Essentially, you've taken the federal dollar for purpose of doing some kind of work, and the federal government says, right now, our preference is A, not B. And I think some people would say, there's a lot of impositions that come with accepting the dollar from a federal payer, whether you're a doctor participating in the Medicare or Medicaid program, or you're a university who wants to maintain $1 billion worth of grants. But in every instance, the moment you accepted the money, you basically bound yourself to accept whatever ideological concern animates the payer at that moment in time. It just so happens, by the way, that we don't necessarily like the animating concerns at the moment. So is this sort of just desserts for accepting federal money in anything we do?
I think there's another really important point here, which is that up till now, the process of getting grants funded or not funded has been done through a peer review process. It occurs within the scientific community. And both of us have served on these committees over the years where we sit around, we review the science, we debate, and we decide how to score a proposal. And if it gets a good score and it crosses the funding line, it gets funded. It's an entirely different process when the president of the United States issues orders saying, turn on the AI machine and run it through all these grants. And if they use certain buzzwords, they just kill them. And I think that obviously is authoritarianism. It's a radical shift from the way in which we have run the scientific enterprise. And while there are lots of problems with the scientific enterprise,
Yes.
and one
Don't
can
don't
contribute
overlook
NIH.
them.
And by the way, you and I could do 3 episodes on that. We've both been living in that world of science. I think it's also worth pointing out that NIH has probably been the greatest producer of extraordinary scientific and medical achievement in world history. I can't even imagine the number of Nobel Prizes and other enormous achievements that have come out of the NIH in the number of years that it's been running. So I think it's important, again, to not confound legitimate criticism of the NIH or the NSF or any of these with this radical, authoritarian, really cataclysmic change in how decision making is made from a democratic peer review process where experts, look at the evidence, and the president of the United States and the people around him. I think that to me is the most radical issue. And of course, the words that they don't like obviously fit a particular ideology, and that's not surprising, but it's that ideology that is so alarming. And we've started to talk a little bit about that, right? It's the elimination of so many of the things that are so dear to those of us as physicians who have made a commitment to the people we care for, who are not all of one group. We care for a diverse group of patients. We care for people with disability who are marginalized. We know that people who are trans exist. We know that they have particular challenges because of the social order. They have higher risks of suicide, which brings to mind one recent example of the federal government basically banning a paper by actually a colleague of mine that was on a federal website that talked about addressing suicide risk in trans youth and ways to screen for it. And he was asked to remove the word trans youth from it, which of course makes no sense. And actually, he and another colleague who had been looking at the problem of diagnosing endometriosis in trans individuals was also banned. And they actually took the federal government to court with the help of the ACLU. So I think that's actually an example of the medical profession or members of the medical profession courageously pushing back. I think that's unfortunately not happening enough, but that's the kind of challenge that we face right now.
Yeah, one of the things that's kind of interesting is I do homeless scholarship. I do a lot of work on homeless healthcare. And on the one hand, I actually have not written in a way that uses most of the words that appear to be on the alarm list of the federal government. So that suggests there's ways to describe many problems that maybe aren't filled with quote unquote buzzwords. At the same time, it would be impossible to write honestly without using the word disparity or a word that refers to someone's gender or transgender status. Those things are relevant to who winds up homeless and what kinds of health conditions occur. So it would be quite difficult to literally eradicate those words from all work related to the healthcare population. And that makes me want to draw this closer to where physicians can get caught up in potentially authoritarian structures. There's some from history. I'll list one. I'll ask you to think of others that you might come up with. But I have read a little bit about psychiatry in the old Soviet Union. And there was a lengthy period of time in which opponents of the regime were psychiatrically hospitalized as having a mental illness. Could seem like an extreme example, though, compared to the current moment. But do you have other ideas in mind of where physicians have ceded way to authoritarian structures?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, obviously, very notorious. It was under the Nazi regime. And I was just so struck by this when I started reading about it, is that more than 50% of physicians joined the Nazi Party, which was much higher than other professions. And then 7% of physicians actually joined the SS, whereas only 1% from other professions join the SS. And what's also striking is there was no evidence of coercion. There's no evidence there was any punitive action taken against physicians who chose not to join the Nazi Party. They were very happy to jump on the bandwagon. And of course, many of the Nazi atrocities would not have been possible without physicians who were triaging people to be shot because they were too weak, or to be sent to labor camps, or to be experimented on. So I think those atrocities are easy to dismiss and say that's so horrible that can't
Yeah.
have any relevance here.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think that it's worth thinking about why physicians seem to get into so much bad stuff in authoritarian countries. And you do see this in a number of places. First of all, we tend to be rule followers. In order to gain admission to medical school and to graduate requires a lot of compliance to authority. I think that there's a socialization of a process during medical training that sort of breeds out the anti-authoritarian. I think that physicians get very quickly corrupted by capitalism. In fact, you and I did a whole episode where we talked about that. And I remember, just not to single them out, but for example, orthopedic surgeons who do more and more of types of surgery that have literally been proven in sham trials to be of no benefit and are highly invasive. I mean, they're major surgeries. We talked about the way physicians tend to police patients. That was actually our last episode.
Mm.
Are easy to fall for that. We talked about the fact that physicians tend to be careerist and ambitious.
Yes.
And so
Guilty as
for easy, yeah,
charged.
we don't want our careers to be derailed by just a few little words that we're not allowed to use on grant proposals. And by the way, if you happen to be a physician who works for the NIH and the NSF or whatever, it's very easy to say, all right, well, okay, it's not the way I would do things, but yeah, we'll cancel these grants. We won't accept any of them if they have these words. So on both sides of the fence, it's very easy to just kind of do a little hand waving and a little bit of justification, not realizing that there are real human beings who you're erasing. There are real, serious research questions that are going unaddressed that have major implications for people. And so for these, and I think probably a few others, I think we have a bad track record in terms of our behavior under authoritarian systems.
So we've raised up the example of physicians who just joined the Nazi Party, but weren't necessarily being the Dr. Mengele of the system, although some were. We've raised up the example of psychiatrists who were co-opted into supporting state institutions. I imagine the response to that is to say, look, in America, if you're participating in the healthcare system as a clinician, you see people in your office who have a cough or a cold or high blood pressure or a psychiatric challenge, and you offer whatever you've learned in medical school or whatever guidelines suggest you should give. Is there really any room for the state to enter into that decision process that could cause you to do the wrong thing for your patient?
Obviously, it's hard to predict where this is
I
headed.
know, and it's an unfair
Yeah,
question
but
in a way
no,
for
it's an
me.
important one. It's like my biggest concern, at least in the short term, is really twofold. One is this sort of passive accommodation. Whatever comes our way, whatever we're told not to talk about, what to research, not to care for people. I know, in fact, that there's actually a bill in Congress to not, if you work at a federally qualified health center, not to care for immigrants who fit certain categories. I mean, all of these things are coming down the pike. And unfortunately, our tendency is just to be like, okay, I guess, all right, won't do that. As people who are low income increasingly get cut out, right? As we see, if for example, if $800 billion gets cut out, and all of a sudden we have patients who, in tens of millions of patients who no longer have access to health care. What do we do? You're just like, well, sorry, it's not really my problem. And what about our professional organizations right now, which don't seem to be saying much about this?
Yeah.
So I think it's both the accommodation and the laissez-faire attitude that concerns me at this point. Now, are we going to start shooting people? Are we going to start declaring people mentally ill because they are asylum seekers?
Doubt it.
I have no idea. I guess I would say that it depends on what happens in this country. People in other countries are no better or worse than us. I think it's important to recognize that. It's important not to have this notion of exceptionalism and to think, well, we're somehow special. We're not going to become that. In fact, that very view has often been what gets societies into trouble, is somehow thinking that this is not going to happen here. I wouldn't prognosticate. I would say that so far, the various professions have been very quick to do whatever the Trump administration says. At Columbia, they're allowing people to get arrested without due process and taken away without saying a word about it. Their own students. You get the picture.
And, so for immigration enforcement in particular, I'm aware that some teaching hospitals, they have been having sessions to prepare the trainees for the idea that enforcement agents will potentially enter the health center, community health center, teaching hospital, seeking their patients. And the supposition is sort of, hey, you need to call a supervisor, let people up the chain know what's going on. But it's also understood at this point that law enforcement will have its entry into healthcare institutions for purposes of seizing people and taking them away. I suspect that that does change the nature of what a hospital or a clinic is, if it's that kind of a place.
Yeah, it sure does.
The issue you raised of who we take care of, this is where it gets tricky. So we evolved a healthcare system in the United States. It's incredibly costly. There's now a lot of people who can't easily get healthcare unless there is a payer. So that includes the Medicaid program. In the United States, a lot of people who have low income are supported by that program. And remind me, do I have this right that there's some obligation to care for people, even if they are not necessarily possessed of immense money? What's the level of our obligation in that?
It's interesting. I was looking back at the oaths that we take. In theory, we take. I actually don't remember taking an oath when I.
Me neither.
You
I
didn't.
don't
Okay.
remember taking an oath.
Yeah. So yeah, that shows that we're on the older side. But we both predate the white coat ceremony.
Yes,
But
that's
what's
true.
interesting is if you look up the oath. First of all, nobody actually says, as far as I know, the actual Hippocratic oath anymore.
Yeah.
It's actually not a great oath. It does have some good stuff in it, but the whole first section is about like making sure that you're loyal to your teacher and that you don't share trade secrets and things like that. Not really the kind of
It's
stuff
guild.
that
It's about being
it's
in a
guilt,
guild.
yeah. And then there's actually some very good stuff in the second part of it, but I think people understood it really wasn't the right oath for today. So if you my understanding from looking at this is that there are like several different oaths that kind of float around that are used by different medical schools. There's one that comes from the Declaration of Geneva. There's a 1964 modified version of the Hippocratic Oath. There's of course the Oath of Maimonides, and they're pretty nice. They don't go into a lot of detail about what you do as a member of society. They talk a lot about your obligations to your patient, which is of course at the center of being a physician. But they make general statements. I'm looking here at, for instance, the modified Hippocratic Oath that says, quote, "I will remember that I remain a member of society with special obligations to all my fellow human beings, those sound of mind and body as well as the infirm."
Hmm.
There's the Declaration of Geneva makes a reference to, "I will not permit considerations of age, disease, or disability, creed, ethnic origin, gender, national identity, political influence." I don't actually see where it says ability to pay.
Yeah.
That's not there. Actually, it's not in either of them. And then if you look at the Oath of Maimonides, it says, "May the love for my art actuate me at all times. May neither avarice," well, they're getting a little closer there, "nor miserliness, nor thirst for glory or for a great reputation engage my mind. For the enemies of truth and philanthropy could easily deceive me and make me forgetful of my lofty aim of doing good to thy children." So actually, the reference to avarice there, I think, is pretty much the only allusion I get.
Yeah.
And so there's surprisingly little about our obligations to the poor. And I think that
Yep.
that's important to talk about, because I think that certainly my values as a physician, and I think I'm not by far from alone on this, are that healthcare is a right, and that it's part of a just society that people have access to healthcare. Now, clearly, our country has not made a commitment to that, but most civilized nations have actually made a commitment to that, and have certainly gotten much further and much closer to it than we have. But I think that the question becomes, as physicians, what do we do? Do we speak up when there's a catastrophic cutting of access that's looming on the horizon? Should it be on the websites of our organizations? Why isn't it? Why do these websites instead talk about just a potential small cut to our earnings? So I think these are issues that are deeply moral and should be things that we're reflecting on and talking about.
Yes. And I think that, just to put that very clearly, what you saw on websites is that the rate of payment for Medicare, which nearly every physician or medical organization relies on, raised a concern that the AMA was willing to declare on its website, but that potential threats that seem implicit in ongoing congressional negotiations in the United States about the Medicaid program simply haven't drawn the same level of concern, even though that concerns potentially all access to care for a large population. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and I think there's one critical point about all of this. If your ethos as a physician is that I'm in this calling because I have a commitment to caring for people of all creed, color, wealth, that part of being human is that you become ill, you become sick, you become vulnerable, and that I've entered this
Hmm.
profession so that I can be there
Hmm.
for all who are in this very vulnerable state of need.
Yeah.
And that it isn't about anything else. Everything else is essentially background. Now, of course, it doesn't mean I want to do all this for free and never get paid, but it means that that's at the center of why I'm a physician. And I think that what we're seeing in all of this, what we see, whether it's in the corruption of physicians from healers to killers in Nazi Germany, whether it's websites that focus on physician payment but not on the threat to the people we care for who are vulnerable, whether it's hospitals that are quick to cancel services to certain groups of patients, even anticipatorily, because they're concerned about the bottom line. What all of this signifies is that that fundamental commitment to being there and to connecting with and helping and serving those who are in need because of illness is not at the top of the list when it has to be foremost. And we can kind of poke fun at these oaths in a way because they are a little bit lacking, but I think these oaths, for the most part, are about that commitment
Yeah.
to the person who is ill and in need of help.
Yeah. We've kind of identified that there is a potential track record or a risk to us as physicians stepping into line or falling into line a little too quickly without recognizing where our ethos is. Maybe we have to kind of come to how do we hold on to this if we ourselves are at risk. Like, I should say, I work in one federal setting. It's a bit scary, and frankly, when I get home each day, I think, man, how do I hold on to who I am in a situation when I'm not sure whether my own values as a clinician are going to be upheld? I worry about that. So I guess the question is, how do I or people like me or people who are in other domains of practice hold on to who they are and their professional obligations in a way that might stand strong?
And I think that on the one hand, maintaining a moral compass in a situation that is frightening, where there are threats, is hard. On the other hand, it's fundamentally grounding. And I think having a compass that you're true to, which are your professional values, and that you don't compromise, while it can be frightening because you're being pressured to abandon them, is also very centering. And I've noticed that the bravest activists, those who are willing to stand up under great threat, the sort of happy warriors, I'm thinking of people like actually Maria Ressa. I don't know if you've watched interviews with her. They exemplify that. I've often wondered, why is it that these extraordinary individuals who stand up to illegitimate authority are often so unafraid and so comfortable? And I think it's because they have made just a commitment to a set of values, and that's what guides them. And in a certain way, it liberates them. And I think that as a profession, as individuals, that I think is what we're called to do.
I also think it's possible that for a period of time, we individually or as a profession may wind up failing. There's a lot of ongoing stress and pressure, and we may not be as strong as we want to be for the next year or two. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure that we are going to always accredit ourselves well in the coming year.
I think the most important, and again, this is an individual decision, but I think the most important thing is to actually push back hard and early.
Hmm.
Um, Whenever what you do is being challenged, and to actually, often you have to recognize that you are being asked to give up long held beliefs. I mean, it's amazing how quickly, just a few months ago, everybody was about diversity, equity, inclusion, pronouns, and you could criticize some of that, but I think what's behind it is a recognition that we live in a very inequitable society, that access to healthcare has been deeply inequitable, that it's had profound effect on marginalized people. Those facts didn't change in the last couple of months, and we're being asked to forget them. And we have to say no. No, we don't forget them. They're just as important as they
Hmm.
were then. Now, we can have disagreements over whether our approaches are the best ones, but people are still disabled. People are still unable to pay for healthcare. People are still getting treated badly or unfairly because they're Black. I mean, all of that is incontrovertible. I mean, there's mountains of evidence, and so those problems don't go away. And we're being told to just no, that's not happening. Never mind. And I think we're like, no, of course it's still happening. I think medical journals, for instance, should
Hmm.
should put out a statement and saying we here at the New England Journal of Medicine are going to continue to welcome papers that use the forbidden words like health equity and women, and that'll in no way affect our review process. And so that you don't have to worry about, can I say inclusive in a statistical analysis. And I think those things should be said overtly. For instance, yeah, both you and I do practice in the VA system, for me at least in part, and for you entirely. And I think that that's an area where we're getting hammered. I mean, if just for instance, I was reading just the other day about how psychologists and psychiatrists who who got the whole return to work order, they don't have enough office. So they've been put in like these cubicle farms. And basically, they're sitting there trying to have conversations that are highly private with their patients, with people walking back and forth behind them. First of all, that's a gross violation of HIPAA. It's very disturbing to their patients. And the New York Times actually interviewed some of those patients, and
They
they
don't
didn't
like
like it at
that. Yeah.
all. And, that's a place where these health professions should be saying, no, that's not how I practice. I'm not going to do that to my patients. And I think this is the insidiousness of it that is so pernicious. And like I said, we're only in like what, week 8 of this, and we have, years ahead of us. So this is where I think we have to recognize and respond in real time, and of course at the cost of risk to ourselves.
Right, but not everybody can take the risk. I'm imagining the therapist who thinks, I have this accountability to my family and my income, and if I raise this concern, I might very well get prioritized for elimination and won't be able to pay the bills. So, I mean, it's one thing to say take the risk, but the question is where and how, because not everybody can afford to lose a job.
Yeah, that's obviously why authoritarianism wins.
At least how it wins
It's how it's
when
win.
it
It's how it
does.
wins. Now, what's particularly disturbing is that these large organizations that are very powerful and wealthy, whether we're talking about Columbia or what is it, Paul Weiss, the law firm, or
Yeah.
ABC, CBS, these huge corporations that are
Yeah. What do you
capitulating,
need us
right?
to do?
Right. They're just saying, "Oh, okay, we'll pay $25 million so that they'll, even though it's a frivolous lawsuit, so that the FCC doesn't block the multi-billion-dollar deal we're trying to do with through some kind of merger." Or whether it's Columbia saying, "Yeah, so we won't say anything about these arrests that are completely illegal on our campus. Academic freedom can go by the wayside as long as maybe they'll leave us alone." So I think, yes, when the big players are afraid, you're right. Then how would you ask the individual who's sitting in a booth to potentially sacrifice their job? That's the dilemma we face. But I think that the medical profession collectively can speak up. I don't
Yeah.
think JAMA is too small to make a statement about its editorial policies. I don't think the AMA
Yeah.
is too small to stand up for these marginalized groups.
Yeah.
And I think that if they do that, and who are they? They're us, right? They're us.
Yeah, I think that's the key is that it can be a very tough call, and I think this has come up for both of us in different ways. When do I take a stand individually? How do I speak up individually?
I will say
And
something about that, though. While I would never speak for anyone else, I do think that if you take a stand on something that you believe in deeply, in other words, you say, I cannot do this to my patients, I will not do this to my patients, and you get fired as a result of it, I don't think it's necessarily a total loss because you walk away feeling good about
hmm,
yourself. And
okay,
I don't think that a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists are going to end up on the breadline. And again, I don't want to belittle the reality of losing a job and how that can be very challenging, particularly if you have a family and so forth. So I'm not going to belittle that, but I also want to make the point that when you capitulate to your basic principles and you agree to do things that you know are wrong so that you can keep your job, that's corrosive. It's corrosive to your soul, and so it's not like you get away scot free when you capitulate just to keep your paycheck. It's
hmm,
not. It's not easy to do that. This is the crisis we're in. You got a choice, and only you can make that choice. It's not a situation of, oh, I'll just let this one pass because you're paying a price to the values that brought you into this work.
I think that's a fair point. I do think that some people are better situated to engage in that combat than others.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
I'm reminded of a story. This is the 1950s and 60s in Birmingham, Alabama. There were a terrible lack of civil rights for people who are Black. And people who joined organizations to protest matters often found themselves fired from their jobs. One of the more effective advocates was my barber, James Armstrong, who sued to get his kids into schools that had historically been segregated. And the great thing about Mr. Armstrong is that he owned a barber shop, which meant that nobody could fire him. He simply could keep the shop open. He was, in some ways, a well placed advocate because the community could continue to patronize his services even when others who stood up and initiated litigation were going to get fired. So he managed to stay in litigation for something like 7 years and ultimately won. So there are moments where one individual is better situated for combat than another. By combat here, I mean protest. But I also share your point that we cannot allow our souls to be ruined or our commitment to patients to be undermined because of the political pressures of the moment.
Yeah, and I imagine that things may have been tougher for him than one realizes. For example, somebody could have come and burned down his barbershop. Uh,
Oh my God, he was tough. Yes. Yeah, he had to station sharpshooters around his house because in our community, it was possible people come by and shoot your home. So no, that was still very serious.
Yeah, and I think, when we find ourselves in relatively low level risk, which is that we might get fired, it gives you an appreciation for their courage, for the courage of people in the civil rights movement, who were attacked by dogs and put themselves in extraordinary harm's way when most of us are afraid. Well, if we work at a big law firm, we're afraid of losing some deals, so that our $20 million salary might get reduced. So I think you see the extraordinary cowardice that
Hmm.
is just if there's anything that has a silver lining to what the Trump administration is doing, is it's revealing the pitiful lack of commitment to anything except the dollar in so many sectors of our society, which, by the way, shows that the rot was there all along. And it just shows that there's some things that are about our society that need fixing and that are very deep seated when we look at the capitulation that we're observing in the last few weeks.
We've set this up as capitulations, and I just wonder if we need to acknowledge again, and I brought this up earlier near the beginning. Fundamentally, liberal institutions are under siege at this time. In many ways, they're seen as having created cadres of bureaucrats and leaders who serve themselves and who yield money to their own pet projects, to the people who align with them ideologically. And some, they're going to say, look, it might be rocky now, but it wasn't all good before. Isn't there something about the moment we're in which is just desserts for a certain rot that occurs within any regime?
I mean, I think that when you have rot, I mean, again, and I'm talking about our medical profession as being a part of this rot. We've talked about this on other episodes, our incredible embeddedness in profit and in capitalism. We've talked about that in some of our interviews with people who look at this, that we as a profession often don't walk the talk. We say these great oaths when we finish medical school and go off to residency, but ultimately what happens? We end up not caring for those who can't pay a lot, for doing lots of procedures that are revenue generating, to becoming an enormous scourge on Medicare when it comes to fraud, and that sets you up for an authoritarian fascist takeover.
Hmm.
Because it's much easier to appeal to people's sense of anger and grievance and to manipulate it. I think that as a profession, there are things that we can do, but I think that if we believe in health equity, we should continue to advocate for it and write about it. I think that we need to stand up for what diversity and equity and inclusion really is. It's been distorted into this caricature when in fact it's really about the fact that there are tremendous inequities. And there's a lack of diversity in our profession. There is evidence that people are not cared for equitably. That includes people with disability. It includes people with different skin color. Trans people obviously are among the most vulnerable. We need to make it very loud and clear that we are safe.
That when people come to us for care, we're safe
Yeah,
for them.
we're safe for them, and we will advocate for them. I think that when it comes to what's happening with our funding organizations, those who are within those organizations, who are part of our profession, need to ask themselves, how bad do I want this job? Am I willing to be somebody
Hmm.
at the CDC who's on board with, say, an anti-vax agenda? It's not what I want, but hey, I get to keep my job. Is that okay? It's clearly not okay for all of them. Today, there was a resignation of a fairly prominent physician from the FDA over vaccination issues. So I think people are beginning to stand up, but I think these are questions we need to be asking ourselves because, all these organizations are just made out of people. All these institutions are just made out of people. They're made out of us. And so I think we need to think both as a collective, and I'm talking about large organizations like the AMA, the AAMC, SGIM, all of these. And it's not enough just to quietly leave our diversity statement on our website.
Hmm.
If you're SGIM, you might go, well, we still have a diversity statement on our website. Yeah, but if you believe in diversity, what are you going to do about the fact that all those words associated with diversity are now forbidden? Are you going to say anything about that? Or are you just going to kind of let it pass? Of course, if you speak up about it, could the government come after you? Yes, you could get an IRS audit. You could have your not-for-profit status removed. All of those threats, and by the way, they're probably going to start doing that to at least a few entities to scare everyone. That's what they do.
Yeah.
So, are you going to take that chance? You might say, your leadership might say, we don't want to take that chance. But that's an ethical decision. It's a profound ethical decision. Are you willing to take risk to stand up for what you believe in? So far, we're not seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a little bit of it, but we're not seeing a lot of it.
Yeah. So as we close this out, I think I think there's a couple points I'd like to make. Even if you find half the things we said in this podcast concerning or disagreeable, we need to be in dialogue with you. And we need a society which allows us to stand up for values that we can find that we agree on, which include, I think, for most of us, care for all. I want to make that point because some people may be resonating on that. The second thing is that I do think you made this point earlier, and it's something that comes up in a lot of work, is that the professions can stand up or they can bend over. And we need to stand up. We need to be strong as a profession. And even when we don't know what to do individually, we should be able to speak to the people who are in our groups and say, what are we going to do? We can still ask that question even when we're stuck on what to do personally.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think one thought I would like to kind of perhaps leave everyone with is that as a physician or another healthcare professional, if you have a commitment to caring for everybody, to being there for anyone in need, for loving them and supporting them, and I mean love in sort of the most broad sense, a sense of shared humanity, the feeling that we have for somebody, regardless of whether they look like us or not, or they're as rich as us or not, or they have the same skin color or not, or they're disabled, or they're an immigrant, or they're a refugee, or they don't even have legal immigrant status. If you believe that being a physician is about caring for them, then I would say start with that and then ask yourself for anything that comes down the pike, any rule or regulation from the government that says, actually, you can't say this or you can't do that. Ask yourself, is that consistent with my values as a physician? And if it's not, then you have a choice. What are you going to do? And that's what that I think is where where I'd like to leave it.
You have a choice. What are you going to do? Thanks very much, Saul, for this conversation.
Thanks, Stefan.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.